Did you wash your hands? Did you wash your hands? Would you turn back to Mark chapter 7? Chapter 7. I want to look at Mark, one of the smaller gospels, Mark chapter 7. I just want to wrap some things up for your hearing. Looking at chapter 7, it's about Jesus. Somebody say it's about Jesus. It's about Jesus. It really is. It's about Jesus. Chapter 7 opens after a whole lot has been going on. Some things Jesus and his disciples have been doing, have been touching, have been referring to. The feeding of the 5,000. Jesus walks on water. Very high time in the life of Jesus. But also in the life of Jesus, he's constantly being scrutinized by those around him. A lot of people don't like his way of thinking. If he's going to be a good Jew, you should do Jewish things. And for Jesus, it was more about not contradicting the tradition, but more of being obedient to the Father. And I will say to you this morning as we begin, it's about living our lives in a way that honors the Father. Amen? Live your life in a way that honors the Father. Look at chapter 7, verse 1. When it opens up, Jesus and his disciples are under suspicion. And the problem is, it's found in that the disciples and Jesus are having a meal. And in that meal, it says that the Pharisees and the scribes, I underline, gathered around him. They came around. I don't know how you feel, but when folk circle you, you know it ain't going to be good. When folk come around you and 3 or 4 of them show up just to have a word with you, you can bet that that word is probably about you. So these learned men, these professional or religious men in the Pharisees and in the scribes, they come to Jesus and they have a strong question for him. And the question is this. They say to him, Jesus, how come your disciples are eating food with hands that are unclean? In some traditions, it says, with defiled hands. How come your disciples are eating with hands that are not clean? And they come to Jesus because first, it looks like that they are concerned about the disciples, but the reality is they're more concerned about Jesus because these are his disciples. And so their problem is his problem. And their problem is, Jesus, you are doing things that contradict what they believe is their Jewish tradition. And not only do they believe it, it is conflicting with it. If you look with me in the 3rd verse, it says, the Pharisees and all of the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. Right off the bat, that was so earthwarming to me. It says, why are your disciples not doing what everybody else does? Why are they not following traditions? Why do they do things that ordinarily are not traditional? Obviously, your disciples are not true disciples. They're not true followers of God. That's really what they're saying. They're saying what we see in your disciples' behavior, they are not one of us. There was a book, I think it was called Whoville. Maybe you've read it, but you remember the Who's? They had this machine that if you ran in the machine and you would come out, you would have a star on your belly. And so everybody in Whoville started to run inside to get into that machine because they wanted a star so they could be somebody. The problem was everybody got a star. And so there was conspiracy in the town that says, we got to do something. We need another machine. And so a little group got together and said, we're going to get a machine that will take the star off our belly. So they went, got this machine, and they ran through the machine, and it took their star off. They were adamant about being different than the rest. We actually live in a world where people, I want to say this real carefully. We live in a world and time where people are constantly pointing at others because we consider or they consider them unclean. They're not good people. They are people who we would rather not associate with. All throughout our political parties, everybody is partying and pointing across the line saying, we are the original followers of our history in America. And then there are those on the other side that say, no, we are true to our values in this country. You are and you aren't. It's ripping many of us apart. But friends, it doesn't stop in the political world. It also goes into the church world. I don't know about you, but I grew up where church folk was always saying, who was going to be saved? And I lived where there were Baptists and there were Methodists. And then there was those Pentecostal people. It's funny, man, they used to call them the Holy Rollers. Y'all don't know anything about that. But they call these people the Holy Rollers. And, if you were a Holy Roller, you was known that you would just break out in ecstatic praise. You would just get all into it. And so I was raised in the Methodist church, and so we didn't sway or anything. We was cold as ice. We'd stand there and sing. You dare not rock, because that was, when I was growing up, if you rocked in the church, that was a sign of Satan. It took us a long time to get drums in the church because they thought these instruments were instruments of the tool of Satan. But isn't it funny how life goes on? Now you can't get in a church without the guitars and the drums and the tambourines and the lights flashing and everything. A couple of weeks ago, I was preaching in a church, and I'm old now, and smoke came off the stage. Woo! Woo! I just had to tell myself, just preach the word, just say it, just preach it. But I had smoke on the stage coming behind me. In my head, I was saying, God, there's something wrong with this. That was my oldness coming. I go, we don't need all that. That ain't what we need. That's not the gospel. All we were doing, all we were saying, all I was saying to myself, there are some defiled people around me. And I was telling myself that I was the clean one. See, when you finger point at somebody, according to this gospel lesson, the finger pointing is all about who is and who is not. But I want to go a step further. The worst part about finger pointing is when it falls on you. When you are considered the person who is the defiled one. One quick just visual. When In the Methodist church and a lot of our more traditional churches, we used to have a place called the pulpit, and it had rails around it. This would not suit my father right now, but we had rails. And so only people who could go in the pulpit were clergy. And if you ever got caught in that sanctified area, one of the older people were subject to grab you by the arm and jerk you so bad. And they'd tell you, boy, get out of there. I didn't have a clue growing up what that meant. I thought it was the church. But for them, it was a ritual. And for them, that ritual meant the presence of God. I want to tell you this morning, be careful how you make some things God. Jesus confronted that because these people came to Jesus and says, your disciples did not wash their hands before they ate. Why don't they wash their hands like our elders taught us? I like Jesus because Jesus is so cool about getting to the real problem. Jesus seemed to listen to them and he found what they were saying, that Jesus said to them, your issue really isn't about washing their hands. It's a deeper issue. They wanted to tell Jesus, our problem with you is your disciples didn't wash their hands. What that sounds like is hygiene. It sounds like they were saying your disciples are not keeping themselves hygiene clean. They are not being concerned about their health. But that wasn't what they were saying. What they were saying is, in the Old Testament, our forefathers, the priests of the Old Testament, knew that there were things that made them unclean. Touching somebody that was dead. Touching a woman who had just had a menstruation period in her life. Touching that woman made you unclean. Coming in contact with a leper made you unclean. And what they did, they transferred that old tradition into a greater tradition here with Jesus, and said, Jesus, your people are not acting like the priest. And I think Jesus probably said, probably not, because they ain't priest. But they said, your disciples are making traditions law. But they're not law. They have rituals without relationship. And Jesus picked up on that. Jesus says, for us, for me and my disciples, we discern that your tradition is trying to replace law. And that doesn't work for the kingdom of God. And of course, they didn't like that. They did not like Jesus saying that their tradition was contrary to the law. Women, I love you, but I grew up where you couldn't wear pants to church. Oh, I heard somebody with me. I grew up where you couldn't wear pants. My father would just have a conniption. And I hate to beat up on my dad. My dad is dead and gone, but he was a good man. But my father was my father. He grew up in his time period. You didn't wear pants to church. I even was in the period of time where you didn't wear pants to school. You would get to school, girls, Then you had to take your pants off if it was a cold, snowy day. You know, but us boys, they ain't never said nothing to us. We wore big pants, baggy pants, drop pants, low pants, high pants. They didn't care. We just wore pants. But it was more about tradition. You ever talk to somebody who's dealing with you more with tradition than they are the commands of God? Some people, whether it's in our church or in our community, they're constantly telling us, don't be like them. I was in a conversation this week, and the conversation, I think, aligns with this. I was with some colleagues. We were doing some church work. And one of the voices in the church says, or in our group says, do you have trouble with people who, when you go to a store, you can't tell if they're a man or a woman? I want y'all to, these are people I hang with. I said, what? They said, I have trouble going to a store where men or a man or a woman, you can't tell who they are. So I said, and? They said, oh, I just don't like it. This one guy said, I know he was a man, but he looked like a woman. And I said again, and? Well, I didn't know what to say to them. My words to them, why don't you just say hello? In their mind, in their sanctified mind, they were saying, I'm so mad at that person for not declaring their sexuality in my appearance, that it's causing me some consternation. And that to me is tradition. That's ritual. And they were saying, I didn't know what to say to him. According to the word of God says, love one another. Says nothing about you got to sit there and determine who they are. Well, he says, my friend says, and the group kind of got into it, and they said, oh, we don't like that. So I said, why don't you treat them the way that you would want to be treated? They were saying, no, because if I speak to them, I would be condoning who they are. I'm sorry. I must have fell off the boat early. But speaking to someone who is different from you in no wise make you like that person. Just because you speak to somebody who is not like you doesn't make you a bad person. One of the tradition fathers of the early church during the 60s, he was a priest in the 60s, and he was known to fight for civil rights. And this brother, this priest, fought daily, and I'm not sure in what camp, but he fought about the rights of all people. And he happened to come up against a Klansman. The Klansman had been hurt during a fight between two opposing sides. That priest went over, began to help bandage that fallen Klansman. People looked at him and says, what is wrong with you? How dare you go and help that man? Don't you know what he stands for? The priest looked at him and said, the gospel that I preach is the gospel that says every man and every woman deserves to be treated the way I choose to be treated. He's hurt, he's broken, he's bruised, and I see him first as a man. I'll share the gospel with him later, but right now I see him as an individual. Man, that's deep there for me. Many of us want to say, I can't help you. I can't talk to you, and Jesus picked up on that. So let me tell you how Jesus turned the page. Jesus says to them, to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, as they talk to him about what wasn't right, Jesus quotes from Isaiah. And Jesus says from the Isaiah text, he says, You honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. You got your tradition down, but your heart is not in your tradition. And I know, reading the Pharisees, that they were probably extremely mad. How dare you do us like this? And so Jesus went one step further. And this is the best part of this text. Jesus says, you are so quick to take a tradition and to make it a law from God when it is not a law from God. It is just a human tradition. He says that doesn't give it a right to be elevated to a commandment of God. Whew. Jesus is so cool in my book. He's cool. So I need you to look at this passage here in the same text. So you got to catch this. Go to the 9th verse. Jesus is really at his best. In the 9th verse of chapter 7, he says, and he said to them, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God. Wow. In order to observe your own traditions. Is anybody catching that? You make your stuff commands of God. For Moses said, honor your father and mother. Here it is. It's getting good. It's getting real good. Honor your father and your mother. And anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. See, they knew that text. And Jesus says, you didn't handle God's command about honoring your father and mother very well. And they said, what are you talking about? He says, the commandment says, when your parents, I want y'all to listen to this. This goes for us. This goes for us old people. When your parents get older, they are to be taken care of financially by their children. Boy, if I was 60 old, I'd be jumping up out the seat right about now. Woo! This is what Jesus is saying to me. Jesus says, the law was written so when your parents get old, you are to take care of them. And Jesus says, that's a commandment. He says, but y'all have rearranged that commandment. Now look at verse 11. He says, but you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Corban. Wow. Now let me tell you what's going on. Jesus says, instead of y'all following that commandment, you've issued another tradition. And now that tradition is what you're trying to tell us to live by. Now, let me tell you what Corban meant. Corban meant it was a tradition of if you had anything, land or money or valuables or jewelry, anything that had valuable, you could pronounce it Corban. So what you would do, you would say, my watch, I would say, if anything should happen to me, Debbie, Corban. Debbie would say, what? Corban. What it meant that I had put a vow on my watch. So if anything really got bad in our life, it was protected. She couldn't sell it. She couldn't cash it out. So Jesus says to these Pharisees, he says, y'all use that Corban tradition all the time. When your parents get old, you take some money and put it in the bank and call it Corban. He says, y'all have been doing this left and right and you know it ain't right, but you said it's a tradition. And since it's a tradition, you say Corban on your money. So if your parents, you have to move your parents into a nursing home. Just getting close to anybody? Just roll your parents into a nursing home and tell them, oh, Mom, I really wish I could help you, but I can't. Mom, you know, I love you and everything, but I ain't got enough money for you and us. They call that Corban. So Jesus says, you have let your tradition trump God's law, and it's wrong. Oh, they hated Jesus now. Because he says, the very law that is to protect your mother and your father, even if they were not good parents, you still owe it to help them in their old age. Jesus says, you're protecting your funds from helping them by calling them Corban. Well, for them, Jesus was just outrageous. Jesus says, well, if y'all don't get that, let me be clear to you. It's not what goes into a person that makes them defiled. He says people are changed really by their heart. And it's their hearts that tell us who they are. It's what comes out of a person. Brothers and sisters, if Jesus were here today, I think Jesus would tell us to be careful. Be careful who you declare unclean. They may not look like you. They may not act like you. They may not praise like you. They may not worship like you. They may not talk like you. But be careful what you call or who you call unclean. You see, Jesus is so much Jesus. He says it's not what a person so much says. It's not what a person dresses like. I know we don't like that in this day and age. I told you for a long time I had trouble with rappers. I just couldn't put my head around rappers. I thought their language was off the chain horrible. I thought some of the things that they were espousing for sure should not be accepted as fashion or part of us. But the more I began to dig a little deeper into each rapper personally, I began to read their story. And once I read their story, their backstory, I go, their lyrics are a doorway to their pain often, or to the tragedies of life often that nobody wants to talk about. And then when we brought it back into the church, I just was ready to just pass out. How in the world are you going to have them rapping in the church? But my brothers, one of the strongest churches in America right now is in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's called Sanctuary. It's one of the largest rapping churches in this country. They are reaching boys and girls, men and women, young millennials who don't look like you and me. But the gospel is going forward. It's reaching them with a new context. It's reaching them at their level. Men and women are young people are giving their life. I wasn't ready for that. I would have said, unclean. Unclean. I close this text this morning. Jesus is very clear to me when we talk about real people, real needs. There are people that these Pharisees says, don't touch them. That's all they were saying. Don't touch them. Anybody you touch who they considered unclean, they were saying, we wash our hands every time we come from the market. Let me tell you why this made such an impact on me. He says, because we know we had come in contact with people who were nasty. And so when we came back home, the first thing we did was wash our hands because we wanted to tell ourselves we were not like them. We were not one of them. We were better than them. We had nothing that reflected us that looked like them. We were not them. And so Jesus, your disciples, have come back and they never washed their hands. And Jesus says, and never will they wash their hands because yes, They were in the market, but they touched and rubbed shoulders with men and women no matter what their walks in life were. Jesus says, I'm going to go to the cross in a few days that will honor them because my love is broader than your traditions. It is greater than your prejudices. It's more than all of your hatreds. I come for every man. My God, don't let your traditions make you hate somebody. Make you think you're better than somebody. Y'all remember in grade school, if they said you had the cooties? Come on. Y'all remember when you had, they said, I'm talking to somebody. What they were saying is, you're not one of them. You're not in. You're not liked. You're not special. And the worst thing in the world to be the person with the cooties. The worst thing in the world is to be that kid over in the side where everybody else is playing and nobody is inviting them in. Jesus says, don't do that. Do not try that. Don't pull that out. You go and become a friend to everybody, whether they got cooties or not. You stand with them. Look at that text. Jesus calls us to connect with those who may not have what you have. Don't consider them unclean.